Renee Talbert, Director of Marketing, and I will be today's moderator. The presentation today is entitled Communicating with the HIPAA Rules, Texting and Emailing with Patients, and it is presented by Adam McCoy, Product Owner at Fytel. Before we begin, I would like to review a few housekeeping items. Adam, can you go ahead and switch to the next screen, please? First, you will have a control panel on the right side of your screen. You can minimize and expand the panel by clicking on the arrow in the upper right-hand corner. Second, you could submit questions by using your question panel located near the bottom of the control panel. We will take time to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the event. So if your question is not answered for some reason or another, we will respond to you individually after the event. And then finally, at the end of the webcast, you will receive a copy of today's presentation as well as the recording. Additionally, when you log off, we ask that you just fill out a short survey. As always, we really appreciate your feedback on these webinars. All right, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce Adam McCoy. Adam has been with Fytel for 4 years and is the product owner for Coordinate and Remind, where he leads a team of 9 people. Adam has successfully implemented email, text, and meaningful use here at Fytel. Prior to Fytel, Adam has held positions at MD Data Corp as a product manager and business analyst, where he was a primary liaison with customers to create business requirements for product development and program implementation. Adam began his career as an actuarial analyst for Berkshire Hathaway home state companies, where he analyzed insurance rates, losses, and market conditions for pricing commercial auto insurance products. After completing his undergraduate work at the Utah State University, Adam received his master's degree in economics from Washington State University. And finally, Adam holds a green belt in Lean Six Sigma methodology. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Adam to begin the webinar. Adam, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I had someone stop by my office this morning and indicate how excited they were for my presentation. I thought to myself, at least that's one of us. I'm a little nervous here, but I am truly happy to be here with you. Let me go ahead and start. I once listened to a Yale professor discuss how the colonists were able to defeat the British Army in the American Revolution. This professor claimed that one of the key factors in the colonists' success was how they defined a win. She indicated that the colonists won by simply continuing to fight. As a result, they developed key strategies around continuing to fight, as opposed to simply winning big battles. Francis Marion executed this strategy perhaps better than any other leader in the American Revolution. After the British defeated the colonists in Charleston, South Carolina, Marion organized the only military unit in South Carolina that was opposing the British. This unit initially consisted of only 20 to 70 men. Through guerrilla tactics, Marion was able to continually limit the British Army and eventually won the Battle of Black Mingo. Marion earned the nickname of the Swamp Fox and is credited in the lineage of the United States Army Rangers. I think we sometimes feel like the colonists must have when we work to improve the quality of care through more effective communication with our patients. We have many challenges, such as patient communication preferences, HIPAA, meaningful use requirements, system limitations, and various others. However, we truly believe that as we overcome these challenges and more fully communicate with our patients, that our patients and healthcare providers can be healthier and happier. So let us define and become as committed to an effective communication strategy as Marion was in his strategy to defeat the British Army. Today, I would like to discuss 5 aspects of an effective communication strategy. These aspects include communication modes, types of communication, registration process and forms, HIPAA assessment, and staff incentives. I knew that not everyone participating in this webinar is responsible for defining the communication strategy within their organization. So I have decided to present the material in the form of questions. This will allow both those responsible for the strategy and those who will implement the strategy to have access to necessary questions that need to be answered in order to achieve an effective communication strategy. So let's start asking some questions. First, what communication modes can we support? Are we really going to send letters? I have seen organizations that have a substantial portion of their patients with a communication preference as letter. In some cases, this has occurred because of legacy systems or past initiatives. So what is wrong with having patients with a common preference of letter, you're asking? Well, nothing, except that some of these organizations have no intent of sending letters to patients. So as we think about our communication strategy, one of the key aspects needs to be what communication modes can we support, or will we support? Next, will these modes sufficiently meet our patient needs and meaningful use requirements? So if we have patients with communication preferences that are not going to be supported, how will we achieve meaningful use requirements and satisfy our patients' needs? One of the things that I've seen here in many organizations or instances is a patient portal default is what I refer to it as, where patients will register for the patient portal, and unknowing to the patient, and in some instances unknowing to the organization, the patient communication preference has been defaulted to patient portal. In some of these instances, this has definitely hampered meaningful use initiatives and goals, and also has not fully been consistent with the patient's actual communication preferences. So another question, how will various communication modes work across multiple systems? This is a really important question as you deploy and use multiple systems to communicate to patients. We're seeing vendors such as Fytel and others that communicate to patients along with their EHRs. And so understanding how these systems work together and how you can effectively communicate to patients with both systems and not confuse patients will be a key aspect to your strategy. So next, addressing the types of communications. What types of communications do we want to send? Do we only want to send appointment reminders via email or text? Do we want to send health reminders and improve our quality of care? Will these types of communications help us achieve our healthcare and organizational initiatives? What roles will health reminders play in our quality initiatives? If we are limiting our communications and our communication modes, we may very well be limiting our ability to achieve healthcare initiatives. We see this especially in terms of meaningful use. Some of my favorite questions are around our registration forms and processes. So one question is, does our registration forms obtain consent for our desired communication modes? I have seen many instances where organizations want to send email or text communications and have not captured the proper consent. Following up on that, how do we know when we have the patient's consent? These are key aspects to address in order to ensure that our strategy and our processes are consistent. Does our registration process support collecting patient communication preferences? This is a very interesting question as you look to often in your EHRs or patient portals where you may be collecting communication preferences to see what options you're providing patients. I think one of the key things that we can address and look at is, can a patient have more than one preferred mode of communication? In fact, I've seen that with some organizations where the patient can define multiple modes of communication that they prefer. This becomes very advantageous for that organization as they think about different initiatives and what modes of communication may align best with those initiatives. So what about HIPAA? I think it is safe to say that many of the HIPAA guidelines have resulted in more questions than answers. However, we have been given some key pieces of information. Let's look at one of these. Here is an FAQ from the HHS website. What we learned here from this FAQ is that we can electronically communicate to patients about their health care issues and treatment, as long as we apply reasonable safeguards. So, what reasonable safeguards do we have in place? I'm not your legal counsel, but this needs to be something that your organization defines. If you are an existing Fytel client, we can definitely provide you with insights and lessons learned on safeguards. What are the messages that we send to patients? How can we limit risk through improving our messaging? I truly believe that this is one of the most important things that we can address. We can definitely achieve our communication goals and limit our risk by ensuring that we communicate the minimum necessary information. We can also validate this as we're testing various communication messages. This is something that Fytel is continually working on as we try different communication messages and seeing what the results of these messages are. Another question, how do we ensure that we have accurate patient contact information? This is something that is also very important, but can simply be done within the practice. I've seen practices that on a regular basis, they will ask the patient to redefine their communication preference. Sometimes this best aligns with the new year. Practices may say to the patient that as the new year starts, they want to ensure that they have the proper communication or contact information for that patient. Next question, have we properly informed patients and collected proper consent? This is becoming more and more important, I think, as we see meaningful use, as we look at how HIPAA is continually evolving as we think about this patient consent and informing patients. One thing that we have done here at Fytel that has been very, very successful is what we call our introductory email. And what this does is it allows the patient to be informed about the communication service that it will be provided. Also, it allows them to opt out. And what we've seen over the past is that when we send out these introductory emails, that we will have a little spike in the opt-out. Patients will, read the email and decide, what, I don't want to participate, and they will opt out. After that initial wave of opt-outs that occur from the introductory email, we very, very seldom see an opt-out from subsequent communications. And this feedback provides us with great insight into, that the patients, become informed about the message, what we're going to be doing, and that we can also ensure that we're pleasing the patients by sending them communications that they want. So one of the last parts of our strategy needs to include staff incentives. As I've worked with various organizations, they'll have great strategies, great goals, and they won't come to fruition. So one question, how can we change our registration process with an already overworked office staff? That's something that comes back very often, is that the staff may be, there may be an overworked feeling, and now we're adding something new to the process. And will the office staff really collect patient communication preferences? We're asking them to do one more thing in their busy schedule. And I think that my observation has been that the right incentives have created miracles. And one example was a contest that an organization provided to their staff employees, where they would provide a gift card to the winner, and this was done on a weekly basis. And the contest would vary, but it was primarily around collecting email addresses or patient consent. And it was really, really remarkable to see this organization go from only a few email addresses to 80% of their patients that had been seen within the year, they had an email address for. And that was really remarkable, and it was simply done through a small incentive. You may think, well, all these different rewards, are they really going to work, and what are they worth? Well, at $50 for a gift card, if that's the difference of having a strategy that's implemented and successful and having a strategy that just sits on the table, I think that's definitely worth a try. So as we look, and we've worked with numerous organizations, and we talked about some of the challenges that we're faced with, HIPAA and the various constraints, I think it's easy for us to feel frustrated and to feel like, can we really make this happen? And what I want to do is, we have this great strategy. We have these 5 things that we can consider. We can ask ourselves these questions. But there's a little bit of lessons learned that I'd like to share with you for you to consider as you move forward with your strategy. And I would just say, avoid some of these common issues. So patient communication preference defaults. We talked about the instance of patient portals before, but this really is an issue where, and it's not just patient portal, it can be letter, but anytime we're defaulting to a communication preference or we're using a legacy system for those defaults, we really kind of put ourselves in a precarious situation, particularly as our initiatives and our goals change. Single patient communication preferences. I would recommend that as you consider your strategy, think about how you can collect multiple preferences per patient. As you think about text messages that may be limited to 160 characters, you think about the various initiatives that you have. You may not want to send, or the information that you need to send is going to exceed 160 characters. Well, if you have the option for a patient to send that through phone, email, or text, you have a much greater chance of successfully communicating with the patient. So I would say, find ways in which you can broaden the communication preferences. Not collecting patient consent. This is very, it appears to be complex, I think, when we first look at it. How are we collecting consent? But I think it's something that can be done quite easily. It just takes focus and organizational initiative. So work with your legal department, understand HIPAA, understand how you're going to collect consent, and make it as easy as possible. If you're not collecting consent, but you're collecting patient communication preferences, you're really not helping yourself out. You've got these preferences now that you won't be able to do anything with. And I would say syncing multiple systems. One issue is systems will, or organizations will look for one system over another, and they will fail to actually find ways in which the 2 systems or the multiple systems can actually work together. And so, failing to really think about how to sync those multiple systems, one can frustrate patients, but it's definitely going to frustrate those that are working to implement your strategy. So Anthony Robbins, better known, I think, by Tony Robbins, is an excellent health coach or a personal motivator, and I loved his quote here. He said, "The way we communicate with others and with ourselves ultimately determines the quality of our lives." And I truly believe this. I think that as we work with our patients and we effectively communicate to them about their healthcare needs and how we can help them, we'll not only make our patients happier, but we'll also be able to improve our quality of life, and as we do this in effective ways. So I'm going to open up for questions here.
Great. Thanks, Adam. This was short and sweet and really to the point. As Adam mentioned, we're going to open up the opportunity for questions at this time. We're going to pause for just a moment. I see a few coming through the queue at this moment. But just as a reminder, if you use the control panel, go down to the questions area, click on the area where you can type in your question and then submit it. And we're going to go to the first question, Adam. The one I just received was, does your solution support patient populations such as Medicare Advantage that may not be tech savvy or use email or any kind of online tool for that matter?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Sure. Does your solution support patient populations such as Medicare Advantage patients? For those that are really not as tech savvy or use emails or any kind of online tool.
That's an excellent question. So let me give the short answer to that, but let me provide a little bit of information about the efficacy of communication mode. So the short answer is yes. However, let me give you an experience that I once had. As we were looking to roll out email here at Fytel, which I was responsible for, one of the thoughts and kind of questions that came up was, well, you know, we have an organization may say we have a lot of elderly patients and we just don't think that email is going to work for them. And to be honest, I kind of thought, well, that's a valid argument. We didn't have any information to validate whether it was true or not, but it kind of sounded right. And so as we looked to roll out email, one of the things that we did was we tested what kind of our response rate was based off of age demographics. And I will tell you this, the #1 age group, broken in 10-year spans, for email adoption was our patients age 60 to 70 or 61 to 70. And so to me that was very remarkable insight and actually quite shocking. And so I would challenge the thought that that people aren't adopting text and email. I think that they are, and the data has suggested that they do, and that some of our notions of, you know, whether we have younger or older populations and which ones actually use which, I think may be, you know, unvalidated. And so I think that I would just challenge that, you know, email and text, I think, are still very, very viable options across the spectrum.
Okay, great. There was one question about something that you made a comment about before, and they asked if you could further explain what you meant by using default as patient communication preferences.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, sometimes where I've seen it is it largely comes from legacy systems or initiatives, but often the case will be that maybe in a system like an EHR, that a default value will already exist. So for example, if I'm a patient and I don't go fill something out on my form, you automatically default it to letter or to phone. And so the value that is attributed to me as a patient, even though I haven't stated it, it's automatically defaulted to some communication mode. That's what I would refer to as the default comm preference.
Okay, great.
And let me further specify that real quick. Meaningful use, if it's not known, if the patient doesn't specify their communication preference, then you are able to communicate via any mode. And so I think in many instances, if the patient won't supply you with the comm preference, whether that's just they don't want to fill out the form or whatever, you're in a better position to have it unspecified than you are by putting a default value there.
Great. All right. Another question that came through is how much personal health information, PHI, can legally be put into text messages or email? Do you know what the law says? I know you're not a lawyer, but...
Sure. So that's a really excellent question, and I'm going to put the onus back on the organization. However, that being said, it's been really interesting. To my knowledge, there has not been a court ruling on this specific with text. And so I think it's one of these things that we're still evolving and still learning. I know of several instances where you've had kind of government programs that have actually been involved with texting, you know, smoking cessation programs or immunization programs, and these have been sponsored or funded by the government. And so I think one of the questions is, the answer is we don't really know 100%. And so the question is, well, what's considered EPHI, not EPHI? I think that really goes back to the organization, and they really need to make that assessment with their legal counsel, and to kind of, determine where in that gray spectrum they want to draw the line.
Okay, next question. Are you using any text-to-action methods? If yes, what type? And I'm assuming with the Fytel solutions he's referring to.
With action methods, can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. Are you using any text-to-action methods? If yes, what type?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I don't know if that means kind of two-way text. So I'm not really sure. Right now we send more, one-way text. So we're looking at two-way text. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's probably my best stab at what I think the question was asking.
If for some reason we did not answer that question to the person's liking, we will go ahead and have them follow up with us, and we can go ahead and expand upon that. So thanks, Adam.
Sure.
All right, next question. What about non-English speaking Medicaid patient populations? How can we provide them, obviously, the communication modes that we need to in order to help them?
That's an excellent question. And to be honest, it's still one that I'm working to answer. I think that the same modalities and preferences and everything that we've talked about still applies. And I think it really comes into the messaging. Are we making our messaging compliant with multiple languages? And then if not, one of the things is how simple is our communication to understand. One of the things that we looked at here at Fytel, particularly when we were rolling out email, was what is the reading level of the audience that we were communicating with. And the American population on average has an average reading level of just under 7th grade. And so when we were looking at communications that may be provided by a provider or health organization, we were seeing that communication written at an 11th grade or 13th grade reading level, and we were saying, well, does the patient even really understand what we're communicating to them? And so I think it really kind of boils down into how simple the message is. I think sometimes we can probably make the message without any words and effectively communicate the necessary message. And so I think we look at that as, what is the message? Do we take into account language preferences? And then also, are we making the communications very, very simple? But in terms of modality, I think they're all applicable. I think it really focuses on the message.
Okay, great. Next question. Do emails need to be sent via portals, or can they be sent via HIPAA rules regarding emails such as Work Outlook and still be legal?
So again, I'm gonna say that's the organization needs to determine that. But let me kind of walk through how portals and regular emails can very, very strongly work together. We've seen many instances where organizations, their portal adoption has been very limited, and so they understand the constraint of, we want to push a portal strategy, we want to communicate more detailed information, but our patients just aren't going there. They're not going to the portal. And so they're kind of struck with this need and desire to communicate to patients through the portal, but with really kind of a lack of adoption. And so this is one of these kind of real key points where I'd say this is where your strategy on how do they sync together becomes paramount. When you have a solution like Fytel and you can communicate to a patient's email and you're not having to go through a portal, you have several great options there. One of them is driving the patient to the portal. You can send a patient communication that wouldn't specify any health conditions or cross any PHI lines and drive the patient to the portal in a very simple way. You can also kind of, sometimes they're called tracer emails where you kind of lead them to that spot, or you might provide just enough information for them to actually then decide they want more or communicate back. And sometimes it's as simple as, hey, this message will go through the portal, this message may go through Fytel, and with this message at Fytel or an unsecured approach, we're going to have that patient call back into the office. So I would just stress this is something that your organization needs to define and determine what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for the multiple systems, whether it's in a portal or in a vendor. And then once you have made that definition and you have kind of your policies there, then you work to kind of optimize the syncing of those two systems and determine what messages will go through unsecured, what messages will go through, have to go through the portal, and then kind of see how you can kind of work the two together.
Excellent. All right, next question. This organization is a program where the specialists answer consulting questions from PCPs, so they're not involving the patients directly. Their question is, what should we consider when using technology, whether it's text or email, regarding the consultation information? They understand that they need to be HIPAA compliant, but what other things should they consider?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good question, and I really like that. Let me we've been focusing on patient communication here, and I think that HIPAA and some of the safety and security regulations have been a little, in my personal opinion, very loose in terms of, when they say reasonable safeguards, it's kind of like, okay, what does that mean? I think when you see some of the there's some FAQ or information on kind of provider to provider or within organization communication, I think that's been much more clear, at least in my assessment. And I think, you're really looking at, using secure applications. So, for example, let's talk about text. There's been questions of, well, can, providers text other providers? And there's sometimes this notion, well, or questions come, well, let's just send a secure text. Well, at least to my knowledge, there's no such thing as a secure text. There may be applications that look like text, but they're not text. They're not what you and I think of as traditional text. They're an application that the sender sends a text via that application, and the receiver has to have that application that decrypts it as well. So I think if you're considering what communications go from provider to provider, you really need to be looking at secured applications, and I think I would just suggest going back to some of the health IT rules. I think it's a little bit more defined or defined better in terms of provider to provider or within organization criteria. So I think, we see much more definition around encryption and things of that nature with applications with kind of organization to organization or provider to provider.
Okay, great. Roughly what % of current communication is being done via letters, phone, emails versus SMS?
So that's a good question. And when I reference types of communications, I would say it depends on the type of communication. So one kind of real easy one to kind of strike out there is letter. We just don't see a lot of interest in letter. So, you can kind of scratch that off the table a little bit, and I would say that letter is, has been by far the least popular of the modes of communication. And so you're really talking about phone, email, and text. I'm going to go two ways. You see types of communications and you say where the organization is. I see some organizations that are very, very email focused. They've really kind of worked through the consent. They have their messages down packed. And I would say virtually all of their communications tend to be email. They may send some phone as kind of a subsequent communication or maybe a backup, but you see a lot more kind of going through email. I see with organizations that haven't adopted email very well, I see much more phone, kind of traditional status quo. So I would say it depends on the type of communication, and then it would also depend on the organization. But, you know, we're starting to see a much stronger uptick. I'd say the last couple years, email has really progressed, and text is starting to progress more. I think we see a bigger demand both from patients and providers for text. But I think the systems have not fully adopted the text. Either that's consent, you know, you have FCC requirements, HIPAA requirements, and if you're collecting HIPAA requirement consent, you're covering the FCC requirement for consent as well. So I think text is just, it's desired and it's there. It's just the systems probably haven't fully adopted it. So I would say at this point it's still probably phone, email, text on average across organizations. But it's going to depend on the organization. It's going to depend on the type of communication.
Okay, great. We actually received a couple of questions regarding email safeguards. So if you can kind of jump back again and expand upon what you were talking about regarding reasonable safeguards when sending emails.
Sure. So when you look at the HHS FAQ, they actually give you some there. And in fact, the introductory email that Fytel adopted actually kind of stems from that information. But there's a few, and I mentioned them before, but let's review them. I mean, when you're talking about informing the patient, you know, you're talking about that can happen at the registration process or within the registration process. It can happen through things like an introductory email. It can happen through separate communication, maybe you know, a pamphlet in the office or something of that nature. So actually informing the patient, you know, that's one reasonable aspect or one reasonable safeguard. And then following up on that, once they're informed, obtaining consent, you know, for what you're going to be communicating to them with. And then I would say, you know, kind of going back to it, I think as we look at the messaging is so crucial. You know, it's actually quite amazing how if you look at a message and you really take time to think about what your goal is and how you can craft the communication to meet that goal, you can, in so many instances, simplified communication, not jeopardizing in any way, shape, or form, HIPAA can provide you with your end result. So again, I mean, this goes back, your organization has to determine what those specific criteria and policies are in terms of HIPAA compliance with modes such as email and text and in any mode for that matter. But you know, reasonable safeguards, you know, how have you informed your patient? Have you got consent? Do you know their information's accurate? What are you communicating to the patient? Those are really some things that you can address in your safeguards to make sure that you feel comfortable with what you're doing.
Okay, great. Kind of taking another jump back to some of the discussion we had on Portal, the other question was, where do you maintain the opt-in and opt-out data at Fytel or within the EMR?
So that's a good question. I think I understand it. It's kind of more or less where do you, I'd say that question may be better better phrased in where are you collecting consent, perhaps? So if that's really the question, where do you have consent, I'd say you have it in both places. You have it in both places. You're collecting it. Sometimes that's through a practice management system, EMR, and then, you know, is Fytel as we discussed the introductory email process, well, if the patient opts out, they've already stated a preference. They don't want that anymore. And so now, how do you get that back to, the system of record and saying, well, okay, the patient actually doesn't want email. They've opted out. And so I think you need it in both. And so I'd say both is the right answer.
Okay, good. And then kind of going along the same lines then and referencing your point about syncing systems. So how can a system like Fytel complement a portal by being aware of its correspondence with the patient?
Yeah, and so that's a good question, and I think it really goes back to how the two are syncing together. And you think of things like, we talked about some of kind of the teaser, tracer emails, but also kind of what we refer to as post-back. And that's providing the information back to the provider. And so, it's really just connections between the systems and continual communication, technical communication between those two systems. So I think that's when the two systems are in sync, you're putting communication information into both systems, and they're both kind of continually updating with each other. I think that's really the key there.
Okay, great. Another question, during off hours, how should we as an organization handle email and text communication from a patient to a provider if the only after hours coverage is by phone?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and this is where I think that's such a great question and illustrates perfectly the need, in my opinion, for preferences, multiple preferences. As we kind of talked about before, not all modes of communication are equal, and that's not even just saying, okay, one's better than the other, but you look at a simple appointment reminder. I think many people would argue that if I just had a text reminder, that would be the best. I don't want a phone call reminder. Well, maybe when you need to communicate how you're feeling, you don't want to do that with text. You want to actually talk to the provider on the phone. And so I think when we're looking at this, I would kind of go back and say, first of all, work to really consider how you can have multiple preferences. The next thing I would suggest that people consider is just because I prefer a mode does not mean that I've opted out of other modes. So let's take me, for example. Me as a patient, I would prefer an email or a text. I really don't like phone calls. Just me as a patient, I generally won't answer your call unless it's by accident. If you're a provider trying to call me, and it's like I thought your number was somebody else, and so I answered it. I'd rather just get an email and text, and I can handle that on my own time. But that doesn't mean that I've opted out of phone communications. So I would say, there's sometimes a notion, well, if they prefer, phone, then you can't send them anything else. And I would say that notion is false. Sure, the preference will determine things of, well, if you want to communicate to them for meaningful use initiatives, yes, you need to take those preferences into account. But if there's a circumstance or a situation that you want to communicate via another mode, you can look at what preferences are available, but as long as you ensure that you're working within, the available or permissible modes and they haven't opted out, I'd say any of those are fine. And that's what we've seen.
Okay, great. Here's another question, and I might even be able to help answer some of this. The question was, do most EMRs have a patient communication module? If yes, what is their level of functionality? Or do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm going to defer on that. I've seen so many different things and heard, as I've worked with clients, particularly around meaningful use. That's where I've been most, kind of lately working. And I mean, I got an email the other day. I'm not going to name which client or which system, and they said, hey, we just got a notification from our EMR that the communication process for the meaningful use is flawed and we can't use them. So, I think there's definitely some that are better than others, and I can't really comment to which ones are better and which ones are worse, but I think the functionality does seem to vary in my experience, and I would leave it at that. I don't know exactly what EHR you're using and what your options are.
Agree. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said functionality definitely differs. And obviously, if you are looking at any kind of communication module or solution, obviously Fytel does provide that integration with EMRs out there to definitely address those needs for any organization.
Yeah, and if I can, just maybe provide some help for an organization. If you are, struggling with your EHR in saying, well, we're trying to achieve meaningful use, or we're trying to do these other initiatives and it's just not working, I would recommend that you go back to your strategy and say, okay, what do we want to communicate, what modes and what types? And often we've worked with groups that say, well, we can't really do this through our portal, and they may be clients of ours, and we say, hey, well, great, you know what? We've got an option for you. And it may not be the option that they first had in mind with using their portal, but it's an alternative option that's very effective. And so I would just kind of go back to your strategy, see what you want to communicate and via what modes, and then look at your available resources. Your EHR may not be the best way to achieve that, and so you may want to use a third-party vendor to do that. So I would challenge you to go back to your strategy. Once you understand that, then evaluate the modes and not to be too singular on a particular system achieving that.
Great. All right, it looks like we only have a couple of questions left here. One of them is there a responsibility on the part of the organization or provider to assess literacy skills if the preferred method of communication is email, mail, or text?
So
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any official rules, but I would just say, if you want to achieve effective communication, I'd say absolutely you need to consider literacy, and that goes back to the message type. And, you can define a message that can be written at a 6th grade reading level, and it's not easy. I've had several projects where I'm like, how do I get this to a 6th grade reading level? It's healthcare terms. They're just not 6th grade reading level. But I think that with time and effort, you can definitely achieve, getting a message in the necessary literacy level.
Okay, great. All right, actually at this time, that concludes all of our questions. There were quite a few, Adam. So one, we appreciate all the questions that everybody asked, and also, Adam, for you answering those questions. At this time, again, Adam, we really want to thank you for your time today. And we found the information was very informative, and hopefully everybody learned a lot from this particular session. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you go to the next slide, Adam, here's some information how you can reach Adam. You can also reach out to me, Renee Talbert, renee.talbert@Fytel.com. So again, if you have any questions after the webinar, please let us know. You will receive an email that will include this presentation as well as a link to the recording. You should receive it within the next 24 hours from Fytel. Also, please be sure to look for an invitation from us for our 2015 webinar series that will be coming out in January. So with that, this concludes today's webinar. We want to thank everybody for attending, and we want to wish everybody a happy holidays. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.